Welcome to WinDevCon 2007, Debugging in Webdev. This course supposes that you already followed the Art of Debugging course that was available in the WinDev part of the WinDevCon event. If you didn't follow that course, I strongly suggest that you follow it first, because many of the things we're going to talk about here rely on you knowing what we talked about in this other course. We have a few good and bad news to share here. In the good news side, the debugger works. So if you already know how to use debugger in WinDev, well, it's going to be extremely useful, because the same tool, exact same tool, is available in WebDev. Now, on the bad news side, well, it works only in local test mode, which means that when you're doing a Go on your own machine, you will be able to debug. You will not be able to debug when your application, your web application, is deployed either on your test website or your real web server. The second bad news is that, well, the debugger works only in server code. The reason for that is quite obvious. The browser code is executed inside a JavaScript machine on the browser, and writing a full-fledged debugger for that is kind of difficult, to say the least. So they currently don't have any debug tool available on the browser side. The debugger also doesn't work in AWP mode. I don't really know why, because, well, the code by itself in AWP should be the same, but if you currently don't know what AWP is, it's probably not your main problem at that point. Let's just say that it's one of the problems that you face when you are trying to code in AWP. And we'll see in details what AWP is in one of the following courses. Now, in WebDev 12 there are of course some improvement in that department also. The first one is that you will be able to debug the server code in production. What that means is that you will be able, from your machine in your office, to connect to a server that is anywhere in the world and start to debug a session. So clearly it's going to be extremely interesting to be able to do that and see what's going on the server. By the way, this functionality will also be available in WinDev, which of course will help even more. Now, a second good thing is that finally the AWP code on the server will also be usable in the debugger. So there will be no more difference at that level between regular WebDev code and AWP code. A few other good news and bad news. On the good news side, many of the things we talked about in the Art of Debugging course in WinDev are still true. Basically, the whole debugging methodology that you now know is exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you're developing a software for Windows or a software for the web. In both cases, finding out what's going on follows the exact same methodology. Of course, on the bad news side, you now have many new problems to deal with. And by example, you don't have any debug tool in browser code, so that is going obviously to be a new problem. You have to deal with JavaScript error. Most of the time these errors are not created by WebDev per se, but as WebDev lets you integrate JavaScript code from the outside, you can type it, you can use a JS file and so on. All this means that you can and you will have JavaScript errors, and you will have to deal with them one way or another. We're going to see how you're going to do that. Then you have this huge problem of the browser lack of compatibility. what you're going to code is going to work in Internet Explorer and not in Firefox, or the contrary, or of course not in any of the several browsers we already talked about. So that is going to be a big problem that you will have to face when you try to debug something in WebDev. Then another problem is that the behavior is going to be different on your machine and the real server. Remember what we said about the development philosophy on the web. You are not talking about one program working on your computer. You are talking about something that is going to work in two separate parts, one on the server and one on the client machine. And these two machines are totally different. Well, when you are in test mode on your own machine, suddenly these two machines are the same. Which means that you can use, by example, an absolute path to access a file. And you can use the same absolute path to access the same file from the server and the browser code. In both cases, well, the absolute path is correct on your machine. As soon as you deploy that on a server, well, obviously that absolute path could be correct on the server, but if it is correct on the server, there's no way it's going to be also correct on the client machine. So just on that aspect, the behavior is going to be different on your machine and on the real server. Worse, the behavior is going to be different on your test server and the real server. The test server is any machine. I'm not talking about your development machine, but the second one that you have in your office, by example, on which you are deploying the WebDev test server, the one that is limited to 10 connections. Well, when you're doing that, you're installing that on one machine with one particular operating system, one set of permissions, one hardware configuration, and so on. When you're deploying your real application, you are suddenly using either a hosted solution or another server, production server, that is configured totally differently. Suddenly, well, you don't have the same DLLs available. You don't have the same permissions on that server. And depending on what you're doing, it's going to cause a problem. I have an example of in mind. At some point I was asked to work for one of my customers on a problem where we had to do a hash of a string. Well, a hash of a string in WinDev 11 is very, and WebDev 11 is very easy because there's this hash string function, but it was in WebDev 10, so no hash functions. We had to use an external tool. On my development machine, I found two different solutions, both of them working without any problem. One using an existing Microsoft DLL that was in the system, and another one using an external DLL developed by somebody else. Well, I chose to use the Microsoft DLL, but on the production server, this DLL was not accessible. First, it was not installed, and then when it was installed after asking our hosting provider to install it, we couldn't access it either. There was some kind of permission that would not let us call it. So we had to use the other solution and to install it and to make it work on the hosted solution. Just that, it's just one example of all the many things that you're going to find that, well, can be different between your own machine, your test server, and the real server. That's a whole new set of problems. Of course, if you use any outside tools, like, by example, Flash animations, any kind of ActiveX on your website, any kind of Java applet, and anything like that, any outside tool, anything that is not directly WebDev, then of course the behavior is going to be different depending on what version of that tool you're using. New version of Flash, new version of the ActiveX, new version of the Java machine, different version of the Java machine. Will it work with the Sun Java machine or with the Microsoft Java machine? That's really nice. Also, because now you're adding this external tool, is this external tool going to work the same way depending on the browser? Then you have suddenly the problem of these ActiveX that you have to click twice on when you're in Firefox, by example. Sorry, it's not an ActiveX. ActiveX don't work in Firefox, so you will have differences anyway. Then you have the hardware it's running in, and just the hardware will make some ActiveX work differently or some Java applet work differently, and you will have to debug that. So you're just adding a new layer of complexity at that level. So basically, many things you are used to do will just not work. You have to be aware of that. It's an environment that is much more complex than coding for Windows. We are going to do a very fast review of the art of debugging, or at least part of it. Very fast, because we are going to condense everything I said during this whole course in one slide, and it's going to be very, 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 very fast. So, be ready. We are starting. So, what did we say that we should do in the art of debugging? You have to comment your code before you code. It's even more true here because of all these new difficulties. You also have to think debug. You have to think debug. Don't believe in anything. Check absolutely every variable, everything that you can. The problem is somewhere where you don't expect it, or it wouldn't be a problem. Sometimes even debug the WinDev function or the WebDev functions. Remember this example of this href command where the myFile value was 1 instead of company. So learn when to stop in order to find what the problem is. Remember how to stop in a loop. Use the debugger. Learn what to inspect, which is basically everything. Remember to check in every entry point and exit point, do you have the value you are expecting? Think, reproduce the bug. You have first, before anything else, to be able to reproduce the bug systematically in order to be able to test for it. Try to reproduce the bug in test mode. If it's a bug that happens only when the server is in production, it's much more difficult. So try first in test mode in order to have all the tools for debug. Isolate the bug. Command calls to remove function to test if without this function you still have the bug. If you can try outside the normal context, try to really find where the bug is. If the assumptions are not written in your code, write them now before debugging. If you don't know what your code is supposed to be doing, what the value coming inside a procedure or a method are supposed to be, you have no way of checking if they are what they are supposed to be. So if the assumptions are not written down yet, write them as command in your code. And remember, if it's not already done, if you didn't comment beforehand the way you should have, now it's the time when you try to debug something. First, remember what this code is supposed to be doing. Write it down in details inside the code, not on a piece of paper that you're going to lose afterwards. Directly as command in your code, write down what the code should be doing. This way you will be able to check if it's doing what it's supposed to. And first of all, verify entry value and exit value. That's what you need to do to see if the problem is inside the code or somewhere else. Separator code in logical step and repeat to isolate more. That's the exact same thing in webdev that it is in WinDev. Do not believe, verify everything, even the things you know are correct. So really, this is my teaser. Enjoy it. Use that experience as fun. It's fun to find the bugs. It's not fun to have them, but finding them is fun. You can make it work. So, debugging on the server side is like debugging in WinDev. It's basically the same thing. You have the debugger, it's available. You have the trace in test mode only, but you have the trace. There is no info available at that point, remember, because the info will be displayed later on the client side. The trace, when called in the server side, is displayed on the development machine in a separate window. So it's available. Remember, test mode only. Obviously, you don't want your hosting provider to see trace that you are placing in your program. And the biggest part of the code is here in the server side, so all that access, all this kind of thing, all the things you need to debug most of the time is here. Now, debugging on the client side is nothing like in WinDev. It's totally different. There is no debugger. That's the first problem. Trace is available. Info is available. And there is not a lot of code. In fact, it looks more like trying to debug something that happened only in executable mode than anything else. Okay, so you have a new set of problem. And on the client side, the problems that you will find mostly will be display. Display, well, obviously that's basically the only thing that you're doing on the client side, so you will have display problem. If it's not supported in your browser, if it's not supported, if what you're trying to do doesn't work, the best way to solve a problem is not to do it. So if it's not supported, don't do it. That's the easiest way. All the browser compatibility problem, basically same thing. If you have a JavaScript problem because of that, you have a display problem because of that. If it's not supported, you can't do it, so don't. JavaScript problem, well, you're trying to use JavaScript code and you're not a JavaScript coder, you don't know how to debug it. Basically, the easy answer is don't do it. Of course, we'll look a little more later at what you can do if you really want to do these kind of things, but basically the easy way out is something doesn't work on the browser side, don't do it, do something else. Now, when you need to debug the whole thing, that is a problem. You have a complex behavior, the kind we talked about in the web development philosophy course, where you have things that needs to be done on the server side, needs to be done on the client side, and you're in trouble because things are not done in the order you think they're going to be done, and you don't know what's going on, and all this kind of thing. So that is clearly a problem, and that is the main problem that you will have in real debug situation. The first problem is that when you try to use trace to do that, trace is working on the server side and the browser side also, when you're in test mode at least, but these are in two separate windows. So you don't have any common display of what is going on at any given time. It makes it very difficult to really follow up what is done when. There is no common debugger. In fact, there is a debugger only on the server side. So it's really hard to follow this full behavior. It's the main problem that you have in this kind of situation. So remember, you are in test mode. It's true. Everything is happening on your machine. It's true. But that's not the real case. The real case is two different machines, and you will also need to debug that real case to debug on your test server or even on your real server. So how do you debug a complex behavior happening on two different machines? Well, here is my solution. CLlog is working, and CLlog is able to log in a file on the server, and you can call it from both the server and the browser side. There's a trick, of course, but we're going to see that. So, from the server side, it works exactly the same way than you already saw it working on WinDev. You do a global call for direct logging. You create a static object in a procedural class to have the entry point and the exit point logged. But from the client, obviously, all this is going to create a problem. Because first, the objects are not supported on the browser side. Remember, JavaScript only. And the calls to classes even are not supported. I don't know why, because obviously calling one code or another from JavaScript is just a question of telling the JavaScript do this call and on the other side to interpret what you have to call. But currently the calls to classes method are not supported. So there's only HTML and JavaScript on the client. But Ajax is available. And you can use Ajax to call my CLlog class. Here's how to do it. That's the trick. You add a global procedure to your project. You call it, by example, call trace. You allow that procedure to be called by Ajax. That's what you do in the first line of the procedure, where you have the name. You have this red button that you click to have it read, and Ajax is allowed. And from the browser in your code, you do the following. Ajax execute asynchronous, call trace, that's the name of your procedure, empty string, because there's nothing on the browser side that you want to call back once the call trace is done. Then you put there the string that you want to log and the calling code name. Why? Well, because one of the things that doesn't work in browser code is the debug info name of the calling code. It's all done automatically in the trace method if you're not passing it the name of the calling code. But as it doesn't work with browser code, you have to specifically put your calling code name. It's a little less practical than on server side, but it's working. It doesn't block the browser because it's an asynchronous call. Your code is going to continue without waiting for the call to be done. So you need to specify the calling code. Already told you that. And now you have a way of logging server and browser code in the same file. You have a way of following the logic of your application between two machines, the server on one side and the client at thousands of kilometers away. Everything is going to be logged in the same text file on your server. Remember one thing, you may need, depending on the permission that you have on the server, to modify the CLlog class in order for it to log not in the data app directory, but perhaps in your current directory on the web server where you have the right. It really depends how the server is configured. So that is something that you may have to change. But except for that, you now have a solution to really follow up what's going on in your software. And now we'll have a little demonstration about how to log from the browser side in the same file and you will log in the server side, having this way a full log available all the time. This is a small example called WB Debug that we will use also in further courses, in AWP courses in particular. But we have one part of it for debug only. Let's run it. So here we are. It's a very simple window. Forget about AWP button for now. Just the log part. You want to log something. Let's say you want to log test for WinDevCon, and here we're going to have a loop on 50 calls just to see what happened. Here we are. Here we have a trace in the window on the browser side. That's what you could do before without any specific code, just calling the trace, and you have that. Now if we look at the log file, sorry, is there. That's a previous test. So this is the name of the calling code, loop on trace local, and the test for WinDevCon that I'm logging. And you can see you have the 50 of them with the now usual for you date, time, and level. So this is working. It's in a text file again that is in application data. Remember that depending on your setting, depending on the server you're using, if you're intranet or on the web, if you are on a hosted solution and so on, you will need to change where the log file is, but that will be just one thing. We're going now to have a look at the code by itself to see how it's done. It's in the page normal trace. We have this 50 log button. The first thing that we have, of course, is in the project initialization code, where we have, well, CL project again, init the project, same as usual. Then we have this global method. You remember the course on object-oriented programming. So we have this global method of the CL log class to set the mode as logging in a file, and the file is in the get data dir coming from CL project, so the application directory basically. So that's where you would change how you want to log, where you want to log. And then we're setting the log on. Forget the CL session for now, it will be part of the AWP course. If we look at this code, it's very basic again. There's a trace here before calling the loop procedure, after returning from the loop procedure, just to see what we're doing. And in the loop itself, which is a local procedure, for 1 to 50, we're calling the local trace to see what's going on, and then we are calling the Ajax execute asynchronous. Remember that if you're doing that with 500 or 1000, you're going to do, in fact, a denial of service on your own server. So that was just a small example of what you could do. Doesn't mean that you should do that in a fast loop. As you can see, Ajax execute asynchronous, calling this method, which is a global procedure that I created to be able to call it via Ajax, because class methods are not available currently. Here it's empty because I don't want to call back any local method once the call has been executed. Then that's the content of what I want to trace, and that's the name of the local code, where of course you can put whatever you want. You could put the name of the page, the name of the button, and the name of the code. It's up to you. After that, well, you have the call trace by itself. Basically, it's just preparing the information it received, trying to get the debug calling process information if the calling code is empty. So remember what I told you, the calling code this debug info is working on the server side. It is not working for anything that you're called from the browser. So anything that is in browser code, you have to specifically enter the calling code name in your call. Now if it's not there, that's for the server side, it will be taken automatically by this information. And then it's going a regular trace with clog, the same way that now you used to do in your WinDev program. That's it. There is this multitask 15 just to let the program do the writing normally. It's just a question of not trying to do things so fast that the server is totally overwhelmed by the code from the browser. Gives the possibility to have a few calls close to each other, but not, of course, if you do 1000 you will overwhelm the server. And that's it. You have now a system that allows you to log all your action on the server and the browser side. So this solution basically tells you the following. On the server side, everything works normally. But be careful where you log. Remember, you don't have all the rights on a server in a hosted solution. Now, there are several limits on the client that you have to be aware of. Of course, this will work only if JavaScript works. So if JavaScript is not enabled on the client side, this will not work. The good thing is that if it's the case, nothing will work because everything in a WebDev site is done in JavaScript. So JavaScript should work. Now you have the case where you have a JavaScript error on the page. So the first thing you have to do is to solve the JavaScript error. Then you can use the log to solve everything else. Of course, the trick using a static object to log entry and exit inside a procedure doesn't work. If you want to log the entry point and the exit point in any of your code on the browser side, you have to explicitly make two calls to the call trace method. It's a specific call using Ajax. So even if you don't understand how Ajax works at this point, you can use it, but it's a limit. If Ajax is not working on the customer browser, then this will not work. And you need to specify the calling code name. I already told you that. One of the limits that you have also to be aware, an important one, is that it doesn't work fast. Each call goes to the server for processing. It's not a local call. So you have to go through the web to the server being processed and so on. So don't use that in a fast loop. If you have a loop going from 1 to 1000 and doing memory calculation on your browser side, and you put one of these Ajax execute asynchronous call in it, you're going to block the server and the client. It's like doing a denial of service attack on the server. So don't do that. And also, don't leave the calls. We said in WinDev development that you could leave calls to your log system everywhere and put them on a switch, testing if a global variable is true, then activate the log. If not, then don't. Don't do that. Remember, each time you are adding code in your pages, your server has to send that code to each user. You're eating your bandwidth and you are paying for your bandwidth. So you don't want to have everywhere in your project not used call to a log system. There's another possibility. I've been using in that example Ajax execute asynchronous because I didn't want my browser code to be slowed down too much. If you use Ajax execute instead, then the next line of your browser code will be executed only at the end of that call, which means that you could then put that in a loop and not kill totally your server, because of course one call would be done only when the previous one has been finished, but it would slow down your code a lot. This would mean that each time in your loop, when you're going from 1 to 1000 and you're adding 1, it would go to the server and back. So obviously it would be extremely slower. This is useful mostly to see where your user is going, what he's doing, when he's clicking in this order, that order on the thing, and explain why he has a problem that you don't have. And it's also extremely useful to debug the logic of your program. You think that things are done in this order, in fact they are done in that order. You don't realize that this is done before and therefore this is not initialized. All these kind of wonderful things. So that's where this kind of thing is going to be extremely useful. Now that we know how to deal with the logic of your application, let's have a look at some of the external problems that you will find that you will have to manage. One of the main problems that you will have is JavaScript errors. Normally, WebDev should not create a JavaScript error. Their compiler is good enough to create code that is supposed to be working. But you will. By example, when you use JavaScript code instead of WebDev code. Why would you want to do that? Well, of course, if you are a JavaScript guru, then you know how to debug JavaScript and you don't have a problem. But most of the time, you're going to do that because you want to use JavaScript code that is already written, available on the web, there's this and that, I want to add that functionality. One example would be create a photo gallery using something like Lightbox. It's a very nice piece of JavaScript code where you can have, with just one call, a whole gallery that comes over your existing page. You don't have to have another page, you don't have to make room on your page for a picture. It just comes here, create a box at the size of your picture, put it there. It's really, really nice. Of course, now you have to incorporate JavaScript code, and this is going to create problems. So if you also want to make calls to Flash, ActiveX, Java Applet, and so on and so forth, the calls to all these things by themselves will probably be in JavaScript. What are the main problems that you will find when you use JavaScript for any of those reasons? The first one will be the variable naming. In JavaScript, variable names are case sensitive. Just by one letter being not the proper case, it's another variable. And variable names do not support spaces, underscore, accented characters. All things that you can have in your WebDev variable naming. And you are naming fields that are going to be used by the JavaScript code. So in order to manage that and to make that work, WebDev has to replace your variable names by JavaScript type variable name. So all your variable fields and so on are called E1, E2, E3, D1, D2, D3, and so on and so forth. Which means that basically you don't know what is what. When you look at the JavaScript code, you see that something is done on E1, but you don't have any E1 in your page. Well, there are two different ways of knowing what is what, and we'll look at that later. The first thing that you should always do when you're working on variable fields and so on is use the .alias property. This .alias is E1, E2, and so on. You should never do anything in a JavaScript code on a variable name or on a field name, always on the alias. If you access by name, you will get an error. One of the main problems that you will have is that you are not a JavaScript developer. And because of that, when you try to read the JavaScript code and find out a solution, you're kind of lost. Well, that's not that bad. When you have a problem in JavaScript, you will see that JavaScript code itself is quite readable. And you have a problem on a function, well, you do a Google search on that function and you will find thousands of pages talking about it and explaining how to use it and so on and so forth. You have an error message, you just do the same thing. Remember also, one of the big problems is that JavaScript is implemented differently in each browser. One of the things that is different is the structure of objects. You access your page, your HTML page, using document dot in one of the browser, page dot in another one. Then you have the way to access object is different. In some case you're going to use an array, in another case you're going to use something else. So it's just because of that. And you will see when you look at JavaScript that is out there on the web, that it is JavaScript for Internet Explorer, for Firefox, for all of them testing and having two different sets of code. It's it can become very, very fast ugly. So if you want to incorporate JavaScript code, existing JavaScript code, with that example of the light box coming to mind, there are a few simple steps that will help you do that the correct way. The first thing that you have to do is to make sure that the JavaScript code you are trying to integrate works correctly outside of WebDev. So for that, basically, you're going to create a static page, put it in there, and make it work. If it doesn't work outside WebDev, well, you probably should find another code that does. Then, the first thing you have to do, the second thing you have to do in that case, is to understand how the code is working. If you try just to slap this JavaScript code inside your browser and pray, it won't work. You have to understand how it works, where it's supposed to be, and how to call it. All that is only possible if you understand what the code is doing. If the code that you're trying to incorporate manage several browsers, which is often the case, ask yourself the following questions. Are the browser that manage the one you want? If the code that you are using here is for Internet Explorer and Firefox, and what you need is Opera and Firefox, obviously it won't work. So find another one. Do you need this code to manage all these browsers? If you have a code that is extremely complex that manage all the browser on all the machines, Mac, Linux, Internet Explorer, this version, that version, and so on, but you plan your website for only Internet Explorer and Firefox on a Windows machine, why should you keep this very complex code that you will have trouble maintaining? Okay? Can you simplify? Are you able to just remove the part that don't interest you and deal with the remaining part? Now, if it doesn't manage several browsers, if it's only for Internet Explorer, do you need the code that manages several browsers? If it's the case, find another code. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of JavaScript code, free JavaScript code available out there that you can use. So don't use something that is not adapted to what you need. That's the first thing. We are now in the case where you have an error in JavaScript. You need to get the details of this error, obviously, and this is going to be different. The process to get the error details is going to be different depending of the browser. So let's look at the two main ones. In Firefox, in the Tools menu, you have an error console available. So open it before loading your page. That's my advice. You just have your Firefox open, you go in Tools, Error Console, you open the Error Console. It's a second window. You clear the existing message. There's a button for that, so you have an empty Error Console, and then you run your page or your pages, your whole website. It's a very, very basic debugger. What it will do is give you information about the error and the warning that are happening in your code, and also it will let you look at the value of variables. You have a basic expression field where you can enter the name of a variable and you will see what's in it. So really it's very basic, but it's a debugger of a sort. Now in Internet Explorer you don't have that. What you have is a little error message at the bottom left of the Internet Explorer window, and you have to click on it to open a details window. In this you will have way less information than in Firefox, just the error message basically. So if you have the choice, do it in Firefox if you can, because of course remember, then often errors are happening only in one browser and not in the other one. It's something that works perfectly in Firefox and not in Internet Explorer. You won't have the Firefox error console available. That's the end of it. Once you have the JavaScript error details, so if possible in Firefox, if not in IE, but at least you have an error message and you have a variable or field name that is concerned by the problem. So at that point you have a very ugly JavaScript name, WebDev generated something like E1, D1, D2 and so on, depending on the type of fields. It's a different letter and then it's a number. So it's really ugly and you don't know that name. That name was generated automatically by WebDev. So two ways of dealing with that. The first is to hover on each field that you have on your screen, and in that case, in the tooltip that appears, you will have this ugly name displayed. Of course, that doesn't give you the information if it's a variable. It's only if it's a field. But there's another solution that is more powerful. You can change the WebDev behavior for the variable naming and several other things. If you go in the page description, so that's if you want to change that only for the page. If you go in the page description, advanced, then optimization of HTML code, custom, you can change this behavior. Now if you want to change that for your whole website, it's in the project description, project, option for generating the HTML code, advanced. So you have two different ways where you can change this behavior for the page or for the whole project. Remember one thing, they are doing that for a reason. Reducing the size of the variable is going to reduce the size of your page, so the page will be faster to display. So there's a very good reason to do that. Also, if you are changing that behavior and in your variable names you are using underscore, spaces or accented character, well, you're out of luck because this will not be supported by JavaScript. So don't use that for the web. So what are the options that you can change? Compress the name of the controls. That's the .alias property. If you uncheck that, then the control will keep the name they have in the WebDev editor, which means that you can now create web control names that are not JavaScript compatible. Also, you have the generate short JavaScript procedure names option, where you can tell I don't want to do that, so you will have your procedure name with the name that you are using in WebDev instead of P1, P2 and so on. Compress the names of CSS style is a little less interesting for you, but it's also an option that you can change. And compress the WebDev JavaScript code is something that you can want to change, because what they are doing also is removing all the carriage return, all the thing, in order again to gain a few bytes and have the page load faster. So obviously it makes for a very ugly code and very hard to read. These are options that you should reset with their original value once you're done debugging. Now, okay, you know what the error message is. You know on which of your field or variable it's acting. So at that point, remember, you're not a JavaScript developer. So look for the error details on the web. Just copy and paste the error message without a variable name, of course, in a Google search, and you will find thousands of pages explaining that this error happened when this, that, the other. So you just read that and you know why. Also, look at the correct syntax of the JavaScript code in codes on the web. You are calling something and there's a bug. Well, it's because obviously you are not calling it correctly. So what is the correct call? And you can correct that in your JavaScript code. It is not that complicated. You are already coding in W language. Correcting a bug in JavaScript language is not that much more complex. You can solve it even without knowing JavaScript. I know, I do. What are the most common error that you will find in JavaScript? We already saw a few of them, but let's review that and see a few more that are very often your problem. So most of the time you have a variable name problem. You have an underscore, you have spaces, you have accented characters that are creating a problem. Change that and you solve a lot of your problem. Then you have this browser incompatibility. You are doing something that is not working in this browser or that browser. So try another code. There are so many different versions of JavaScript code available on the web that before you start to really try to debug or modify your code to adapt to this browser or that browser, generally it's much faster to find another code that is already doing that for you. You find one on the web and that's it. Then you have the very often case of the missing .js. A file with the extension JS is in fact a JavaScript program. And well, you are using code that is calling one of these programs. And you are calling something that is just not there, and you have that problem. You can't find the corresponding file. So just add it. How do you do that? Well, when you want to call a code that is in a JavaScript external file, you go in the project description, project tab, additional JavaScript file, and you list it there, and then WebDev does the rest for you. Now you also have the case of missing files or misplaced files, whatever they are. The JavaScript code is looking for a file in the current directory. I'm not talking about a JavaScript file, but image file, data file, sound file, whatever, and not finding it. So the question is, what is the current directory? And it's much more complex, of course, than when you are in Windows. It could be the myproject_web directory. It could be the myproject_web UK directory if you're working in multiple languages. It could be myproject_web UK res directory. So instead of doing it that way, what you can do is you change the code to use an absolute path. But once again, you have to find the correct absolute path. What is the absolute path of this directory or that directory in your server when you're working? That's something that you have to find out depending on where you're putting the file. Once you know it, you put all your files there and you just use the absolute path and you're done. Then of course there is the problem of something that works in test mode but not on the server. Remember, in test mode you are in the very specific and unnatural case for web development where the server and the client are the same. It will never be anything like that in the real use of your website. So you are in fact testing in a very bad case. Some things are in that specific case accessible directly, directory, files directory, your project directory is accessible by using C colon / my project / my project name / my project _web, and you have the file there and it's working. But of course this will not work when you are on the server. So really some things are accessible here that will never accessible in the real time. So these things won't be on the server. The main thing that you have to remember about that problem is that you shouldn't wait till the end to test on an external server. And you shouldn't wait till you think everything is good enough to test on an external server. You should do that from as the beginning of your development cycle, because well, if you wait till you finish these 4 modules before you test on the server and you have a problem in something that you worked on last month, you don't remember it the same way than when you just did it, and perhaps you won't know where it's coming from. If you test for each step on your external server, then it's much easier to find out which part is creating the problem. The strict minimum is to use the test server, the 10 connection server on another machine and test on that one. That's the really minimum that you should do during your whole website development cycle. That's not enough in my opinion, because again you will have differences between that server and the real production server where the permission will be different, the hardware and software and the OS will be different. So really that's not enough, but it's a strict minimum you should test all the time on on your test server. It's really better to do your testing on the real server during the whole development. If you, at the end of each day, as soon as you finish one module, you publish on the real server, you don't have to have the real URL for that. You can use your test URL, but if it's on the real environment, you can test there. You can even have other people test from outside and test with other browser and do things that you do not do yourself. So that's a very good way to find problems early and solve them. Okay, you know, the only thing I did since yesterday is I added that module, but suddenly this other one doesn't work anymore. So how this module affects that one, you can understand that much more easily if you do it when it's happening. And remember one thing, read the help. There are many things that are said in the help about this kind of problem. Read them. Read the whole help. I know it's boring, but there are so much information available, and then you see all the questions that are here out there on the forums where basically the answer should be read the help, read the whole help, it's there. Don't wait till you have a problem to read it. And also remember to read the notes in the help, not just the header. The notes are full of exceptions, things that do not work in this case, do not work in that case. Things where they're telling you, be careful, this will not work when you are on test mode, this will not work when you do this or that. Read the note, it's extremely important. And remember also to check in the help what works where. Remember this beautiful line of icons with all the different things that WinDev, WebDev and WinDev Mobile are able to do. The WinDev icon, WebDev icon, the server, WebDev icon, browser, and this and that. Check what works where. When you see that something is working only on the client side, it's working for you, but as soon as you go on the server, it's not working anymore. Or perhaps I'm not calling that from the right place, or I'm not calling it the right way, and so on. So really read the help, read the whole help, the notes, and check what works where. So why do you want to use JavaScript, Flash, Java, or an ActiveX? Well, either you are good with that, you are a JavaScript guru, you know perfectly well this ActiveX or that Java applet, and in that case you shouldn't have any problem debugging. It's what you do for a living, so that you don't have any problem with that. Or you need something that doesn't exist in WebDev natively. And if it's the case, it can be something like sound. You want to do a beep at the end. By example, you create a wonderful timer online, and at the end, when you reach 0, you want to have an alarm. Well, obviously, if you don't have any sound capability, you're in trouble. So that's one example. You want to do something, some kind of pretty stuff. Like the example is the light box to display images. Question is, do you really need it? If yes, well, you will have to implement that and debug that and take the time and the trouble to deal with that. If you don't, remove it. Is it worth the trouble? Is it worth the trouble to have that wonderful, pretty light box displaying the image, or can you just open a stupid WebDev page with the images in it? Will it be paid? Will it be worth it? Simplify everything you can is really the motto that you should follow. And of course, if you do that, will it work everywhere? Is that going to work in other browser, other machine, other system, or the hardware? Remember also what will happen with the next version. As soon as you are using something external, what will happen when you change the version of anything? Windows, browser, the thing itself that you're using when there's new version coming out. Will it work? One of the main things that people love in WinDev and WebDev is that nearly everything is included. And the reason for that is that, well, they don't have to worry about what will happen when there's a new version out. All the things included will still be there. Now, if you're using something outside of WebDev, you again fall in that possible problem. Basically, there are two different cases. Either you're coming from HTML coding, PHP coding, JavaScript coding, all these kind of wonderful things, and in that case, WebDev is absolutely marvelous, and Debug in WebDev is a breeze. It's easy. You have no idea how easy that is. Now, of course, if you are coming from WinDev, you are totally and irremediably spoiled. You are used to many things, you are taking them for granted, and they are just not available. These things do not exist on the web, at least yet. So you are spoiled. You will have to deal with something that is, well, less powerful, more difficult. It's on the web. Deal with it. So debug in that case is difficult, but only when you compare it to WinDev. When you compare it with everything else that's out there, it's basically very easy. So always consider the easiest way. When you have trouble doing something, you want to do something for your website and you have trouble doing it, just don't do it. Remember one thing. You compare your website to what exists out there, to what is working out there. Well, obviously the most successful website out there is something where there's nearly nothing on it. Think again, the Google website. Empty screen with just one field in the middle and a few links. That's it. Very, very, very simple. Very little functionalities. All the power is behind the scene. So if you have trouble doing some pretty UI, some pretty things all over the place, just don't do it. That's the best thing that you could do to solve your problem.